The morning of June 15th started like any other wedding day should. The small town of Millbrook was buzzing with excitement as preparations for the most anticipated wedding of the year were in full swing. Sarah Matthews, 24 years old, and radiant in her grandmother's vintage lace dress, sat in front of the mirror in the church's bridal suite, her hands trembling as her sister Emma applied the final touches of makeup. Sarah had never seen her groom's face. This wasn't some arranged marriage from centuries past, but rather a love story that had bloomed entirely through letters and phone calls. David Harrison was a soldier stationed overseas, and their romance had begun when Sarah, working as a volunteer for a pen pal service supporting troops, had been assigned to write to him. For 18 months, they had shared their deepest thoughts, dreams, and fears through handwritten letters that crossed oceans. His letters revealed a man of incredible depth and sensitivity. David wrote about his childhood growing up on a farm, his love for literature, his dreams of becoming a teacher when he returned home. He described watching sunrises over foreign landscapes and thinking of her, of planning the life they would build together. Sarah had fallen deeply in love with his words, his mind, his heart. When he proposed through a letter that made her cry tears of joy, she said yes without hesitation. The plan was simple. David would return home just in time for their wedding. They would see each other for the first time at the altar, adding a fairy tale romance to their already unique love story. Sarah's friends thought she was crazy, but she was convinced that what they had transcended physical attraction. She loved his soul, and that was enough. Emma finished applying Sarah's lipstick and stepped back. "You look absolutely beautiful, Sarah. Are you ready for this?" Sarah nodded, though her stomach was churning with nerves. "I've never been more ready for anything in my life. I love him, Emma. I know it sounds crazy to everyone else, but I love David Harrison more than I ever thought possible." The church was packed. 300 guests filled the pews, including many who had driven hours to witness this unusual romance come to fruition. Sarah's father, James Matthews, a stern but loving man who had initially been skeptical of his daughter marrying, a man she'd never met, had come around after reading some of David's letters. The young man's character shone through every word. The organist began playing the processional music. Emma, as maid of honor, walked down the aisle first, followed by Sarah's cousin Jenny and her childhood friend Maria. The congregation rose as the wedding march began, and all eyes turned to the back of the church. Sarah appeared at the entrance, her arm linked with her father's. She looked radiant, her blonde hair perfectly styled beneath her grandmother's pearl tiara, her blue eyes sparkling with anticipation. As they walked down the aisle, she searched the altar for her first glimpse of the man she was about to marry, David. Harrison stood at the altar in his dress military uniform, and Sarah's first thought was that he looked exactly as she had imagined, tall, broad-shouldered, dignified. But as she drew closer, her steps began to slow. Something was wrong with the left side of his face. It appeared scarred, damaged somehow. By the time she was halfway down the aisle, Sarah could see clearly what David had never mentioned in any of his letters. The entire left side of his face bore the severe scarring of what was obviously a devastating burn injury. His left eye was partially closed, his cheek and jaw deeply scarred and discolored. It was clear that he had suffered terrible injuries, likely from an explosion or fire. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. Her steps faltered. She could feel the weight of 300 pairs of eyes on her, could see David's hopeful expression, despite his disfigurement. But all she could think about was that he had hidden this from her. He had never told her he was scarred, never prepared her for this moment. Panic overwhelmed her. The fairy tale romance she had built in her mind crumbled in an instant. This wasn't the wedding she had dreamed of. This wasn't the husband she had imagined. She felt shallow and horrible for thinking it, but she couldn't stop herself. 3. Rose from the altar, Sarah stopped walking entirely. "I can't," she whispered to her father. "Daddy, I can't do this. James looked at her in shock. Sarah, what are you talking about? You're almost there. But Sarah was already pulling away from him, already turning back toward the aisle she had just walked down. I'm sorry, she said, loud enough for the first few rows to hear. I'm so sorry, but I can't do this. And then Sarah Matthews, still in her grandmother's wedding dress, ran. She ran down the aisle, past the shocked faces of her family and friends, past the photographer who was too stunned to lift his camera, past the flower girl who began to cry at the commotion. She ran out of the church and didn't stop running until she reached her car in the parking lot. Behind her, the church erupted in whispers and gasps. David Harrison stood frozen at the altar, his scarred face showing a pain far deeper than any physical wound he had ever endured. The minister stood speechless, his Bible still open to the marriage ceremony he would not be performing. Sarah drove for hours that day, still in her wedding dress, crying until she had no tears left. She finally stopped at a roadside diner 3 towns over, where a kind waitress named Ruth brought her coffee and didn't ask questions about why a bride was sitting alone in a diner on what should have been her wedding day. The aftermath was devastating. Sarah's family was mortified. Her mother, Linda, didn't speak to her for weeks. Her sister, Emma, who had been her closest confidant, looked at her with disappointment that cut deeper than any anger could have. The town of Millbrook buzzed with gossip about the bride who had run away, about poor David Harrison who had been left at the altar. David himself disappeared from town shortly after the wedding debacle. Sarah heard through mutual acquaintances that he had requested a transfer to another base, that he couldn't bear to stay in a place where everyone knew about his humiliation. She learned that his injuries had come from an IED explosion in Afghanistan, that he had spent months in military hospitals undergoing surgeries to save his life. The fact that he had survived at all was a miracle. Sarah moved to the city, ostensibly, to start fresh, but really to escape the judgment and shame. She found a job at a marketing firm and threw herself into work, trying to forget about David Harrison and the worst decision of her life. But forgetting proved impossible. She tried, dating other men, but every relationship felt hollow. She would find herself comparing every man to David, not to his appearance, but to the beautiful soul she had fallen in love with through his letters. She still had every letter he had ever written to her, stored in a shoebox in her closet. Sometimes, late at night, she would read them and remember why she had loved him so completely. In one letter, David had written, I dream of the day I can hold your hand and tell you face to face how much you mean to me. I picture us growing, old together, sitting on a porch swing, watching our grandchildren play in the yard. I know that whatever challenges life throws at us, we can handle them together because what we have is real and deep and unshakable. Reading those words 3 years after running away from him made Sarah cry until her chest ached. She began volunteering again, this time at a veterans hospital. She told herself it wasn't about David, that she just wanted to give back, but she knew she was hoping to somehow atone for what she had done. Working with injured soldiers, many of whom bore visible scars from their service, made her realize the depth of her own shallowness. These men and women had sacrificed everything for their country, and she had run away from one of them because of how he looked. One veteran in particular, a young man named Marcus who had lost both legs in a bombing, became a friend. Marcus was funny, intelligent, and had a girlfriend who visited him every day. Sarah watched them together and saw a love that transcended physical appearance, a connection based on who they were as people. You know, Marcus said to her one day as she helped him with physical therapy exercises, my girlfriend Jennifer tells me she's never been more attracted to me than she is now. She says that watching me fight to rebuild my life, seeing my strength and determination, makes her love me more every day. Real love isn't about perfect bodies, Sarah. It's about perfect hearts. Sarah knew he was right, and she knew she had thrown away her chance at that kind of love. 4 years after the wedding that never happened, Sarah received news that changed everything. Her sister Emma called her with the information that David Harrison was back in town. He had left the military and was working as a high school English teacher, just as he had always dreamed. But the news that really shattered Sarah was that David was engaged to another woman. "Her name is Catherine," Emma told her over the phone. "She's a nurse at the Veterans Hospital one town over. They met when he was volunteering there for a support group. Sarah, she's wonderful, and she looks at him like he's the most handsome man in the world." Sarah hung up the phone and cried harder than she had since that terrible day at the altar. The thought of David finding love with someone else should have made her happy for him, but instead, it filled her with a jealousy and regret so intense it was physically painful. She realized she had to do something. She couldn't let David marry another woman without at least trying to explain, to apologize, to tell him that she had been a fool. The next weekend, Sarah drove the 3 hours back to Millbrook. The town looked smaller than she remembered. She drove past the church where she had humiliated David and herself, past her parents' house where she no longer felt welcome, and finally to the small cottage where David was living. She sat in her car for an hour, trying to work up the courage to knock on his door. When she finally did, David answered. 4 years had been kind to him. His scars had faded somewhat, and he carried himself with a confidence she didn't remember from their wedding day. When he saw her, his expression cycled through surprise, confusion, and something that might have been pain. "Sarah," he said simply. "Hello, David. Could we talk?" He stepped aside to let her in. His home was exactly what she would have expected, filled with books, comfortable furniture, and photographs of what she assumed were his students. Everything about the space reflected the man she had fallen in love with through his letters. "I heard you're getting married," Sarah said, the words coming out in a rush. "Congratulations! I'm sure Catherine is wonderful." David studied her face carefully. "She is. Thank you, David. I came here to apologize. To explain, if I can. What I did to you was unforgivable, and I've regretted it every single day for 4 years. You don't need to explain anything, Sarah. You made your choice, but you don't understand. I was scared and stupid and shallow, and I threw away the best thing that ever happened to me. I loved you, David. I loved you so much, and I was unprepared. You never told me about your injuries." David's jaw tightened. "Would it have made a difference? If I had told you in a letter that I was scarred, would you have still married me?" Sarah opened her mouth to say yes, but she stopped. She owed him honesty. "I don't know," she admitted. "Maybe not. And that's what makes me so ashamed. I thought I loved you for who you were, but when it came down to it, I failed the only test that mattered." "I didn't tell you because I wanted you to love me first," David said quietly. "I thought if you loved me enough, it wouldn't matter what I looked like. I was wrong. You weren't wrong. I did love you enough. I was just too young and too scared to be worthy of that love. David, I know it's too late. I know you're with Catherine now, but I need you to know that leaving you was the biggest mistake of my life. Not a day goes by that I don't think about what we could have had." David was quiet for a long moment. "Sarah, do you remember the letter I wrote to you about the sunrise I saw in Afghanistan? The one where I described how the light made everything look golden and beautiful?" Sarah nodded. She remembered every letter. "I wrote that letter 2 days after the explosion that did this to my face. I was lying in a hospital bed, my face wrapped in bandages, not knowing if I would ever look normal again. But I was thinking about you, about our future, and none of that seemed to matter. I thought love could overcome anything." "It can," Sarah whispered. "I know that now." "I learned something important after our wedding day," David continued. I learned that I deserve to be loved by someone who doesn't have to overcome their revulsion to be with me. Catherine doesn't see my scars as something to overlook. She sees them as part of my story, part of what makes me who I am. She's never once looked at me the way you looked at me that day at the altar. Sarah felt her heart breaking all over again, but she knew he was right. I'm happy for you, David. Truly. You deserve that kind of love. I loved you, Sarah. For 18 months, I loved you with everything I had. But that day at the altar, I realized that the woman I had fallen in love with through letters and the woman standing in front of me were two different people. The Sarah I loved would never have run away. You're right, Sarah said, tears streaming down her face. The Sarah you loved would have seen past the scars to the man she adored. I wish I could be her again. David walked to a bookshelf and pulled out a familiar shoebox. Sarah's letters to him, every one she had ever written. I kept these for a long time, he said. I thought maybe someday you would come back, that you would have grown into the woman I thought you were. But I realized I was holding on to a fantasy. He handed her the box. I think you should have these back, and I think you should stop punishing yourself for being human. You were young and scared, and you made a mistake. But that mistake doesn't define you unless you let it. Sarah took the box with shaking hands. I love you, David. I know I have. No right to say that, but I do. I will always love you. I loved you too, Sarah, and part of me always will. But love isn't enough if it's not paired with courage, with commitment, with the willingness to choose each other every day, even when it's hard, especially when it's hard. Sarah nodded, knowing their conversation was ending. Will you be happy with Catherine? David smiled, and for the first time Sarah saw the joy she had robbed him of on their wedding day. I already am happy with her. She makes me laugh every day. She challenges me to be better, and when she looks at me, she sees everything I am, not just everything I'm not. Then I'm grateful to her, Sarah said, for loving you the way you deserve to be loved. As Sarah prepared to leave, David stopped her. Sarah, there's something I want you to know. The reason I didn't tell you about my injuries wasn't just because I was afraid you wouldn't love me. It was because I was afraid of becoming defined by them. I wanted to be David, the man who loves literature and dreams of teaching, not David, the scarred soldier. But I've learned that my scars are part of my story, part of what makes me strong. Don't let your mistake become the only thing that defines you. Sarah left David's cottage that day, knowing she would never see him again. She drove back to the city with their letters in the passenger seat, finally understanding that some mistakes can't be undone, only learned from. 6 months later, Sarah read in the local newspaper that David Harrison had married Catherine Phillips in a small ceremony surrounded by family and friends. The photograph showed a radiant couple, deeply in love, looking at each other as if they couldn't believe their good fortune in finding one another. Sarah cut out the photograph and put it in her wallet, not to torture herself, but to remind herself of what real love looked like. David had found someone who loved him completely, courageously, without reservation. And someday, if she was very lucky and very brave, Sarah hoped to find that kind of love too. But more importantly, she hoped to become the kind of person capable of giving that kind of love. She began therapy to work through her issues with superficiality and fear of commitment. She continued volunteering with veterans, not to punish herself, but because she genuinely wanted to serve others who had sacrificed for their country. 2 years after David's wedding, Sarah met James, a teacher like David, but one who had never seen combat. James was kind and patient, and when he asked her about the scar on her heart, she told him the truth about David Harrison and the wedding day that had changed her life. I want to be the kind of person who would have stayed, she told James. I want to be brave enough to love someone completely, no matter what. James listened to her story without judgment. The fact that you recognize what you did wrong and that you've worked to change yourself tells me everything I need to know about who you are now," he said. Sarah married James 3 years later in a small ceremony with just their immediate families present. As she walked down the aisle toward a man she loved deeply and completely, she thought about David Harrison. She hoped he was happy. She hoped Catherine appreciated the extraordinary man she had married. And she hoped that someday David could forgive the young woman who had been too afraid to see past his scars to the beautiful heart beneath. The story of Sarah Matthews became a cautionary tale in Millbrook, but also a story of redemption. She had made a terrible mistake born of youth and fear and superficiality, but she had spent years learning from it, growing from it, becoming a better person because of it. David Harrison became one of the most beloved teachers in the county. He and Catherine had 3 children who adored their father and never once thought of his scars as anything other than proof of his courage and service. David occasionally spoke to groups about his military service and recovery, and he always ended his talks with the same message. Real love sees past the surface to the soul beneath. When you find someone who loves your soul, hold on to them with everything you have. He never mentioned Sarah by name, but those who knew the story understood the deeper meaning of his words. In the end, both Sarah and David found the love they deserved. Sarah learned that true love requires courage and commitment, while David learned that he was worthy of being loved exactly as he was. Their brief love story, though it ended in heartbreak, taught them both invaluable lessons about what real love looks like. And sometimes, perhaps, that's enough. Sometimes the purpose of love is not to last forever, but to teach us how to love better the next time. Sarah Matthews ran away from love once, but she spent the rest of her life running toward it, braver and wiser and more grateful for its precious gift. The bride who ran away became a woman who stayed, who chose love even when it was difficult, who learned that the most beautiful faces are not the ones that never show wear, but the ones that bear the marks of a life fully lived, courageously loved, and generously given.